In this segment we're going to look at how color and shapes can work together to form pattern. Pattern really relies on two things in order to work. It relies on rhythm and repetition, and the two are interrelated. So rhythm is often created by the repetition of a shape creating negative and positive space, or as we've seen with colors, push and pull with different kind of contrasting colors. So even just by repeating the word rhythm here, you can see how some shapes create an enclosed negative space and feel very different than shapes that rely purely on repetition and interlocking forms. So this actually, the repeated H here begins to actually look like a ladder, like a continuous form, whereas the Y feels more like perhaps a pattern or a series of things connected together. So let's start out by taking a simple shape and playing around with it a little bit and seeing what we can do in terms of color and shape and pattern. So to begin with, let's, instead of using a solid shape, let's maybe use the same shape. Let's take this hexagon and we'll use it as the outline so that it's got an inside and an outside, so immediately we're having to think about two different colors, and we'll be able to get some push and pull between negative and positive space. So one thing we could think about is really just how this shape relates to itself. What kind of patterns can we make from looking at this shape? So if you think about just the shape overlapping, straight away here you create two chevrons and a diamond, so you've immediately started to form other shapes out of the original shape, and that's a really interesting part of pattern. So you could look at, depending just in the relationship between these two elements, you can begin to build some quite interesting, quite kind of fun relationships that can be the basis, the foundation for what your pattern might be. And as soon as you start to have even more elements than this, if you start to work with, let's say we start to work with 3 elements for instance, you can see here now we're building various other shapes, much more complexity. We've got different scales of shapes, we've got repetitions of diamonds, we've got self-contained shapes, more open shapes. And just, when you're starting to work with pattern and shape, a good idea is just to play around a little bit. And this can form the basis of, building logos, identities, any of these things, as well as actually building proper usable pattern. But there's a lot of graphic elements that really rely on just playing around visually with forms and thinking about how they lock together and how they make other shapes, other patterns, other forms. So here we're really just working with a linear shape, so there's a limited amount of possibilities. So we could think about things like alignment that we looked at, we could think about repetition, for instance, and how shapes might make other shapes. We could think about scale and how you might take the same shapes and maybe scale them down to make another part of a pattern or of an object. And we could also think about rotation as well, and think about how that might relate to building some kind of pattern or object. And if you're working on making patterns like this, I would just really think about it in a very loose way, a very playful way, because I think it can be a great way to actually learn about how to make pattern and how to make form just by doing it, especially in an instance like this where we're not really looking at anything that's particularly for a particular purpose, for a particular client or anything like that. And all we're really doing is looking at how shapes fit together. And so we're looking visually and looking and learning by watching and doing. And that's really what graphic design is, and the best way to learn about graphic design. And that kind of playful approach also means that it's kind of low risk as well. So if we do something that we don't like, or we do something that isn't successful, it doesn't really matter. We can just get rid of it and start all over again. So let's get rid of this one, and let's start by working on a very simple shape. So let's start with just this black square.